Welcome to People in Transition, the podcast where we explore the moments when people's lives change direction and the individuals who help guide them through those turning points. I'm your host, Bob Gers. Today's guest is David Chami, managing partner of Consumer Justice Law Firm, a nationwide consumer protection law firm dedicated to standing up for individuals when powerful institutions get it wrong. David also serves on the executive board of the National Association of Consumer Advocates, a nonprofit organization focused on advancing and protecting consumer rights across the country. Over the course of his career, David has led or supervised more than 2,000 credit reporting lawsuits, helping people challenge inaccurate or harmful information that can derail careers, financial opportunities, and reputations. His work frequently involves holding large corporations accountable, from credit reporting agencies to background check companies, when their mistakes have life-altering consequences. David's commitment to public interest law began during his time at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, where he earned the Prize for Public Interest Award. More recently, he helped secure a $680,000 federal jury verdict for an Uber driver whose career was abruptly ended because a background check company falsely reported that her driver's license had been withdrawn. Today, we're going to talk about something that affects millions of people, but often happens behind the scenes: employment background checks, how they work, how they go wrong, and what people can do when inaccurate information threatens their livelihood. David, welcome to People in Transition.
Thanks for having me, Bob. I appreciate it.
David, let's jump right in. We have so many great questions, and I want to make certain that there's a good understanding in terms of the background check landscape. Let's start with, how often do employers run background checks today, and who are the companies actually conducting them?
So let's start with this. 95% of jobs, employers are running a background check before they make a hiring decision. So the opportunity to find a job that's not going to require a background check is highly unlikely. It's a very, very low percentage. And there are hundreds of background check companies. They're called consumer reporting agencies. And a lot of times people think of Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion for credit checks. It's the same law that governs employment background screening reports. But in that context, there are a few hundred different companies that could be engaged to run a report about you. And in fact, Uber, for example, will use different companies depending on the type of report they're looking for.
That leads us to, what's the kind of information that typically is included in an employment background check?
So typically, and in fact, I can't think of an employment background check that doesn't look for criminal records. Almost every employer wants to know if the person they're hiring has been engaged in any type of criminal conduct, whether it was a misdemeanor, whether it's a felony, how long ago it was. Some companies will say, well, we're good as long as any criminal record is more than 10 years old. And your criminal records can be reported no matter how old they are. It's not like credit information. So if you committed a crime 25 years ago, it could show up on a background report. So they're looking for criminal records. Depending on the kind of job, they might want to know about your driving record. So they might want to see, what kind of driver is this person? Are they someone that we can trust in our vehicles? They will look at even credit data. If you're going to get a job that requires any type of security clearance for sensitive information or financial records, if you're going to work at a bank, they want to make sure that the person they're hiring isn't in financial trouble. So criminal records are going to run across every job, but it can include things like credit data, proof of your identity. They want to make sure you're not an identity thief posing as the person whose name you're using to get a job, and driving records primarily covers the gambit.
And David, at what point in the hiring process do background checks usually occur? And Do you think that they influence that hiring decision?
I can say with probably 99% of the time, the employer will have some sort of criteria that says if somebody has a certain type of record, they aren't hireable. And the larger the company, the stricter those rules are. Smaller companies, where you're actually interviewing with the owner, it might be a little more flexible. They absolutely do affect employment, whether or not you'll get a job. I've seen people be denied jobs where the record that's showing up is very clearly not belonging to the person. And they'll say to the employee or the prospective employee, I'm sorry, you'll need to correct this. We will not hire you, even though we know it doesn't belong to you until you get it removed. They want a clean background report in their files. So that decision typically is being made to run a background report, though, after they've decided they want to hire you. And many states have laws that actually prevent someone from running a background report until they've extended an offer. And so typically you'll say, yes, the employer will say, yes, we want to hire you. We want to give you the job, but it's contingent on you passing a background report. And the value in doing that, Bob, is they want to make sure that when a background report is the deciding factor, that there's no other excuse. So they say, well, first you have to extend them an offer so that we know if you rescind that offer, it's because of the information on a background report, so that a person has an opportunity to correct that or dispute it if that's the reason they're being denied.
David, with 2,000 pieces of litigation that you've been a part of, you've seen it all. What have you seen as the most harmful types of background check errors that you've come across?
It is very common for someone to be charged with a crime that later gets dismissed or innocent until proven guilty. But, police and prosecutors will sometimes charge you and then realize that the evidence doesn't actually support the charge and they'll dismiss a case. But because data is being picked up by private companies and stored and resold, sometimes those updated dismissals don't make it to the file. Even though if you look at the court record, it says dismissed, these background check companies will erroneously pick up the original arrest and charge without noting the dismissal. And if there's a dismissal, they're not supposed to report it at all because, as we all know in the real world, even though the charge was dismissed, the employer, when they see the charge, sometimes that will create a desire to separate from someone. Well, we don't want someone who's even been charged with a crime. Well, they're not allowed to do that. So those that end up showing up on reports can be very damaging, even though you've never been convicted of a crime. You'll also see people being charged with felonies that later get reduced to misdemeanors. And oftentimes employers are okay with hiring somebody who has a misdemeanor, but not a felony. And so when they don't update those records, those background check companies don't update the records to show that it was actually reduced to a misdemeanor, that can be very devastating. And the worst sort of example of a background check report causing a denial of a job is when it doesn't even belong to you. And because these background check companies are picking up public record court information, it doesn't have social security numbers associated with it, right? So if your name is John Smith, there's a really good chance, if you have a common name, that someone else's crime will show up on your background report and cause a denial of a job. And that's the most frustrating, right? Because you've never been convicted of a crime, yet somehow someone else's record shows up on your report because you have a common name. Those are some examples. There are so many more. Twins with similar names can be, your twin having committed a crime can be a reason why you end up losing a job. It's terrible.
So you've given us a couple of examples of groups of people who might be a bit more vulnerable to these kinds of reporting mistakes. Are there other people that should be on the lookout for this kind of problem?
I would say the immigrant community in general, people who have what I would say non-traditional American names. So anyone who's citizens who've, been here for even, 2 or 3 generations, sometimes when they carry For example, I'll say the Latino community, the Hispanic community, a lot of times you'll see hyphenated names. And even women who hyphenate their names oftentimes get confused. So, I understand the cultural reasons why they do it. I understand why sometimes a woman will say, well, I want to maintain my maiden name, or I want to keep my maiden name. Usually that's better. But when they change their name, so a woman who gets married, who goes from, for example, last name used to be Johnson and now it's Jackson. Now you've got a different name that you're applying for your job under, and all of a sudden you're being mixed with some other person who carries the surname Jackson that you never had but now do. So those are people who can be very vulnerable to what we call mixed files because they're mixing you up with another person.
David, so that we can really bring this whole issue alive to our listeners, can you share a real world example, obviously without revealing confidential details or names or anything, of a case where a background check error really dramatically changed someone's life?
So you talked about it in the intro. Our client, her name was Tamaya Cornelius, and I'm saying her name because it's public record. The lawsuit in the lawsuit and the judgment are public record. She was suffering from some health conditions related to her previous employment disability, and then couldn't maintain or hold down a full-time job that wasn't flexible. And so she decided that she was going to work for Uber because it allowed her to drive and not have to walk a lot. And it allowed her to pick her schedule. And she was making it work. And in fact, had been driving for Uber for 2 years without any issues. And then, as an example, Uber will run a new background report on their drivers every year. So she originally was approved, was renewed, and then in her second renewal, they used a different company called Samba Safety, and this background report run by Samba Safety was saying that her driver's license had been withdrawn or no longer valid, and she was no longer able to drive for Uber, and that was the sole source of her employment. And she disputed. She went to the DMV, got a copy of her motor vehicle record to prove to Samba Safety that she did, in fact, have a driver's license. She sent them two different disputes and they refused to correct it. Went to trial. I mean, we went to trial over this, and in front of a jury, they continued to maintain they had done nothing wrong. They doubled and tripled down. But Miss Cornelius was out of work for nearly a year and ended up having to nearly became homeless, had to rely on family support to keep her ability to pay bills. So her son ended up having to step up and help her, which she was very fortunate to have that. But you're talking about 1 year without being able to work. Some people can't go 1 week without a paycheck. So, and it's unusual for these cases to go to trial. Most of these defendants recognize the error and try to figure out how to come to some sort of settlement. I use that as an example because it was just so unusual to actually have to go to a jury trial to prove the case. And the jury, not only did they award her $80,000 in actual damages, they awarded an additional $600,000 for punitive damages, which is what the jury is saying with punitive damages. The jury is saying what you did was so wrong and so reckless and willful that we're going to punish you by making you pay $600,000 on top of the harm you caused to the plaintiff.
David, can a potential employee pick and choose whether their new employer can do a background check? Does the potential employee have any rights around background checks?
No, they don't have any rights at all. I mean, private employers or even public employers, state and city employers can demand a background check, or they can just refuse to hire you. So if you refuse a background check, you're very likely not going to get a job. And you don't even get to pick which company they use. They choose whoever they're contracted with, and your rights are protected by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It's the federal statute. And I know it says fair credit, but it's not limited to credit. Very commonly used for employment purposes. Like I said, 95% of employers are going to require a background report. And the same reports are being run for people who are looking for housing, right? Apartments, if you want to move into an apartment, you're going to see the same companies running reports for employment and housing. They're tenant screening reports, employment reports, but they're basically running for the looking for the same information.
And I know this question is going to be your own personal philosophy, but are companies, are employers getting something out of utilizing such a, what sounds almost like a draconian process to make decisions to not hire people? Do you think that they're better protected because of this?
So I think the employer wants to be able to say, we did our due diligence before we hired someone. So think about it like this. If you are a bank and you hire someone to be a financial advisor, you are basically representing to your customers that they can trust this employee with their personal sensitive information, their financial information. If that person is an identity thief who is stealing the identities of your customers, and you hired that person who's been previously convicted of identity theft, you're probably going to get in bigger trouble, right? The bank is probably going to be found to have been not only negligent, but grossly negligent. So I think for the most part, the employer wants to be able to say, hey, we had no reason to know that this person we hired was a criminal. We ran a background check and we got a clean report. Same thing for Uber, right? Uber and Lyft want to make sure that they're not putting somebody who's assaulted other people and putting them in the public to drive and transport passengers around if they are violent. So they want to know about violent criminal records to make sure that they're not blamed for being grossly negligent at hiring somebody who was a violent person and then telling, the consumer wants to know that I can trust when I get into an Uber or I get into a Lyft that the company has looked into this person's background and it's safe for me to get into this car.
I would assume that there's some type of dispute mechanism that this potential employee could follow to try to deal with the situation. Can you describe that process to us?
Sure. So look, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the CRA, the Consumer Reporting Agency, the company that's doing the background report, they have a duty to follow reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy of the report that they're creating about you. Okay, so right off the get-go, if they report information about you that you are a criminal and you're not, or that you have a felony when you don't, that information clearly does not meet the standard of maximum possible accuracy. So the moment you receive a report that's been given to an employer that says false information about you, defamatory information, things that aren't true, calling me a felon when I'm not a felon, that's defamatory. You're impugning my reputation. And now this employer who might later choose to hire me anyway might always be wondering, I wonder if that report is accurate. I wonder if, David really is a felon and they just removed it from his report because they weren't sure. So that by itself, Bob, is an actionable claim. I always tell people don't try to go at it alone. Call us, right? Call Consumer Justice or call a Fair Credit Reporting Act lawyer in your neighborhood. We do this nationwide, but there are other lawyers who do this work. The National Association of Consumer Advocates has a list based on your city that you're living in. You could probably find someone. Don't try to dispute by yourself. Now, there is a dispute mechanism that you don't have to use a lawyer for. But the lawyers who do what I do, we don't charge for that service because we want to help the consumer dispute it properly. Because if they don't fix it, or even if they do fix it, you might still have a case And since we don't charge fees, and I know we're probably going to talk a little bit about this, it just makes sense to call a lawyer to let them help you with the dispute process. So you have legal rights. If there's an inaccuracy on the report, you probably already have a case. But if you're in a hurry and you're panicking, there is a way to dispute directly with the agency that created the report. First of all, people don't always know how to get that information. Their employer is supposed to give it to you. So if you get denied a job because of information on a background report, they're supposed to tell you, well, here's the company we used, here's their information, call them. You'll call the consumer reporting agency and ask for a copy of the report so you can figure out what they said about you. And then they have a mechanism. You can typically dispute the information on the report directly on the phone. I personally prefer to do it in writing because if you do it in writing, you have a paper trail of what you told them. People say, well, those phone calls are recorded. Isn't that good enough? And I always say, you know how often I find the defendant will say, what recording? We can't find it. So the dispute in writing is to protect you to make sure that they fix it. And if they don't, you have proof of what you told them. So there's a dispute process that is supposed to resolve the issue, but doesn't always work.
And David, I'm confused, I guess, when you say that you're not paid by the potential employee. Someone's got to pay you. Who does that? What's that mechanism?
Yeah, that's right. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act is what we call a fee shifting statute. What's a fee shifting statute? It means that there's one-way fee shifting. That means that the defendant, the consumer reporting agency, if they reported inaccurate information about you, they are responsible for the legal fees. And so lawyers who do what I do, we assess the claim. We'll look at your claim and we'll say, if we find that you have a valid claim, then we're pretty confident that we're going to be able to bring a case and either go to trial or settle it for you and have our fees paid as part of that settlement. So most consumers aren't going to be able to afford to pay a lawyer by the hour. In fact, it very rarely makes sense to do that. And so, if you lost a job at driving for Uber, and then 6 weeks later you picked up another job doing something else, maybe even making more money, how are you going to justify paying a lawyer $400 or $600 an hour to go after 6 weeks of Uber driving wages that you lost? So, and it's a remedial statute. It's intended to encourage consumers to get lawyers and encourage lawyers to take those cases because it's important that we hold these consumer reporting agencies responsible for not having the proper procedures in place where they're reporting the type of information that can be so detrimental to a person, right? If you cost somebody a job, that can have, like I said, very significant consequences to the consumer. And so the Congress wanted to encourage lawyers like me to take those cases without worrying about how we're going to get paid.
And would one of these background check companies, would they potentially ignore the situation or just fail to correct the information that they have, even if it's wrong?
Yeah. So look, these systems are automated. AI is with all of its glory, AI has a lot of problems still. And these automated systems, I would say they're not intentionally trying to report inaccurate information, but they're doing it with what I call a reckless disregard, right? It's all about costs, right? So they're not employing the best methods for ensuring accuracy because it's more expensive to be accurate. It's more expensive to have a human being reviewing the disputes and actually performing an analysis of the data. So they try to rely on the computer to look at your dispute. AI will read your dispute and try to ascertain, well, what is this consumer disputing? Can we figure it out? Well, a human probably would have figured it out, but we also know that people don't always write the best. Consumers aren't always English majors, right? They're not always saying it exactly the way it needs to be said for the computer to understand it, whereas a human would understand it. So I would say I don't think it's intentional, but it is all about preserving their profit margins. And because of that, yes, they do in fact ignore or fail to correct information a lot. In fact, the case that I just told you about, the Cornelius case, Miss Cornelius disputed twice, and admittedly, the background check company in trial admitted that they did not investigate either of her disputes, which is why the jury hit them with $600,000 in punitive damages. It was their failure to even try to fix it that caused the jury to be so upset and to hit them with such a large penalty.
And David, do you have any advice or insight for a job seeker who might have a criminal history and they're worried about background checks and their employability?
Yeah, I think one of the things I tell people to do is if you know you have a criminal history, the thing I recommend is, look into the employer. And sometimes they'll publish this information like, we're willing to hire you if you have a misdemeanor. We're willing to hire you as long as you don't have a crime of violence. Or, we're willing to hire people with criminal records that are more than 7 or 8 or 9 years old, right? They will sometimes share that information. And if they do, then that gives you the insight to know that your criminal record may not be a problem. There's other mechanisms, there's other things that you can do to protect yourself depending on the record that you have. And a lot of people don't really think about doing this, but especially if your record is older, consulting with a criminal defense attorney and asking that attorney to try to get your record expunged. That basically means erased from the public record. Not every state offers expungements. Some states do. Some states offer what we call set-asides. Well, they will set aside your conviction or they will vacate your convictions. That doesn't mean that they're not publicly available still, but at least there's an acknowledgement by the court that you've been rehabilitated and they've set aside your conviction, or that they've vacated the conviction, which means that they've basically unwound it. Expungements are the best if you can get an expungement because it's never supposed to be visible to anyone. But keep in mind that even if you get an expungement, that doesn't mean that a consumer reporting agency won't have that information stored in their private servers and that they won't report it. But what it does mean is if you have it expunged or set aside and they don't accurately report that, which they oftentimes do not, you would have legal remedies, right? Including damages. You could get money for it. And what I tell people is that sometimes they fix it, but you should still sue them because a lot of times this consumer reporting agency that made the error, even if they've corrected it, they're not correcting it at the source. So a lot of times these CRAs, is what we call them CRAs, they're buying information from what we call data vendors. And even though the CRA has fixed their own records, the data vendor is going to continue to sell to other CRAs for potentially at other companies that you might apply for. And when you sue them, it increases the likelihood that the data vendor gets sucked into the lawsuit and fixes their own information. It makes it much less likely that you will run into the problem in the future, as opposed to just sending a dispute. They go, oops, we fixed it. And they have, but they just haven't fixed it at the source. And that means that even though they fixed it for this particular record, it might still pop up and get you later at another job. So sometimes the lawsuit is a valuable tool to protect you in the future, not just get compensated for the existing damage.
David, if there's one thing you wished every job seeker understood about background checks and their rights, what would that one thing be?
I wish they knew the Fair Credit Reporting Act existed and that they had legal remedies, because it is the work that we do as consumer lawyers. At my firm, Consumer Justice, we are changing people's lives. They come to us thinking, "Oh my God, I just need a hand to get this job," and then they end up oftentimes with thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars for their damages, which they didn't even expect when they came to me. They were just hoping that we would fix the report and make sure this doesn't happen again. A lot of people don't know these rights exist. And so one of the reasons why I'm here talking to you, Bob, is I think it's very important that we educate the public, that they learn that they have these rights, that the Fair Credit Reporting Act is there to protect them in the event of harm, and that they can get a lawyer without having to spend money out of their own pockets, because sometimes they know they have a right, they know they've been harmed, but they don't understand that they can get a lawyer without having to come out of pocket. And that, if they knew that, I think way more consumers would find lawyers to help them, and we would have less of these problems.
I hope that my listeners got as much out of today's conversation with David Chami as what I did. Remember, and he said it again and again, you don't have to face these challenges alone. You can have support that exists for this issue, and make certain that you understand you want to make that next move your best one yet. So let's start building that future you've been dreaming about. Your next chapter is waiting for you. If David or I could help you, please let us know. Thank you, David, so much for the great information that you shared today.
I appreciate you having me on, Bob. Thank you so much.